Hello, everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. The title of today's webinar is Imposter Syndrome. I'm Farah Dawood, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Today's presentation features Professor Pearl Sandick. Professor Sandick will be providing information about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. Do you sometimes feel like your achievements have more to do with good luck than hard work? Like your successes are accidents? Like someday it will be found out that you are in way over your head? If so, you are probably experiencing so-called imposter syndrome, and you are not alone. Today, Professor Sandick will talk about imposter syndrome, what it is, where it comes from, and how to combat those feelings. After Professor Sandick finishes the presentation, the remainder of the program will belong to you for our question and answer session. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only accepting text questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. You may submit questions through the questions panel at any time during the webinar, and we will answer your questions at the end. We will do our best to cover all of the questions that you submit, but we want to apologize if we are unable to cover everything. Finally, a link to today's recording, to the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the webinar homepage. I will note that given the nature of the material, the question and answer session will not be recorded. Please allow 24 hours for video upload. And so with that, let's get started. A little bit about Professor Sandick. Pearl Sandick is an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy and associate dean of faculty affairs in the College of Science at the University of Utah. She is a theoretical particle physicist, and her group studies physics beyond the standard model, including possible explanations for the dark matter in the universe. In addition to her research, she is passionate about teaching, mentoring students, and making science accessible and interesting to non-scientists. She has been recognized for her teaching and mentoring work with the 2016 University of Utah Early Career Teaching Award and a 2020 University of Utah Distinguished Mentor Award. Professor Sandick has recently served on the American Physical Society Committee on the Status of Women in Physics and as the chair of the National Organizing Committee for the APS Conferences for Undergraduate Women in Physics, or QWIPs, and will chair the APS Four Corners section in 2021-2022. Okay, with that, Pearl, take it away.
All right, thank you, Farah, for that introduction. I'm glad to be here today talking with you. Today, the topic that I'm going to be talking about is what a lot of people call imposter syndrome, but it really has a strong relationship to your identity as a scientist. And so we're going to be talking about how these two concepts are linked together. Since we are talking about identity, I want to give you a little bit of a feeling about my background and where I came from. So I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I did most of my growing up in South Florida. So I numbered these as my journey across the country. And in South Florida, I grew up in pretty sleepy towns near the beach, which was fantastic, but I wanted to be somewhere bigger and more exciting with access to more academic activities and museums and things like that. And so I went to the biggest, most exciting place I could think of, which was New York City. And I was fortunate to get a scholarship that made that possible. So I attended NYU for 4 years. Now, I had just about every major that a person could possibly have, everything from women's studies and French literature. And eventually I ended up with a math major. And my plan was to go to graduate school for math, actually, because I didn't really have any ideas about other options until I took the physics class for fun. And it was actually the professor of that physics class, Glennis Farrar, that's a picture of us from last summer, who suggested that it was possible for me to go to graduate school for physics instead of math. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a really great idea. So I did go to graduate school for physics. I moved to the University of Minnesota, and that is where I really developed my identity as a physicist. I hadn't considered myself a physicist before that. I was I studied a lot of things in college, and physics was one of them, but not the only one. And at this period, not only did I develop my identity as a physicist, but I also became a teacher as a teaching assistant, and I became a researcher, and I started to gain confidence in my abilities. When I graduated from the University of Minnesota, oh, I actually have a picture too. There's me as a teaching assistant. That's a picture from the olden days, as my daughter would say. After I graduated from the University of Minnesota and got my PhD, I moved to the University of Texas at Austin for a postdoc in the theory group there. And I loved it, except that there wasn't, as a postdoc, I didn't do any teaching, and I really missed that part of my experience, that part of my job. And so when I got a job offer at the University of Utah in 2011, I was really happy to accept it, and I have been there ever since. So as Farah said, I am currently an associate professor. I have mentored postdocs, graduate students, undergrads, and high school students. I have now taught at all levels, from intro courses or courses for non-scientists to specialty graduate classes. And I've also been involved in leadership locally and through the APS, as you heard. So it was through those leadership opportunities, and also in examining myself and how my identity interacted with my personal identity interacted with my professional identity, that I started to learn, especially about gender-related social issues, to help me understand myself and also the people I interact with. So what drives me as a scientist are the science questions, of course, and also helping people reach their potential. Let me just tell you a little bit about the science questions that I'm interested in. So my research is in particle physics and dark matter theory and phenomenology, and I would love to give you a talk about that. But today I'm going to talk about something else. So I want to take this little opportunity to tell you what kind of science I do. And the questions that I'm interested in answering are things like, what is the particle physics beyond the standard model? What is dark matter? Is the universe supersymmetric? And if so, how do we figure that out? And all of this really gets at the more basic question, what is the fundamental theory that describes our universe? So the types of phenomenology that I'm looking at in order to answer those questions or help answer those questions are how we can discover new particles at the Large Hadron Collider, future collider experiments, other collider observables that are consistent with new particle physics that we expect. And then all these questions related to detecting dark matter. So direct, indirect, and collider searches, astrophysical signals of dark matter, and how we can use all that information to figure out what the true nature of dark matter is, and therefore how it fits into a theory of physics beyond the standard model. So all of these things have to do with this particle physics cosmology connection. So that's sort of the research side of things, and that's what I like to do with my time, and I'm not thinking about other questions. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is not physics, and so I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm a physicist, I'm not a social scientist, and a lot of what I'll be telling you about is based on social science research. So I'm going to do my best, and these are things that I've learned about, in order to improve the ability of physicists to thrive and support one another and to learn about myself. But this is something that I'm learning in addition. So this is not what I do for my profession. So that's one disclaimer. And I also want to say it's really important to listen to the social scientists and also physics education researchers who study these issues in detail and are experts on this. The other disclaimer that I want to give is that most of what I've learned in my career is related to gender. And so the concepts and the issues that I'll discuss are also applicable to other minoritized groups. And basically, I mean, anyone who is or perceives themselves to be other than the majority population. So that's sort of one lens that you can be looking at this through, even though a lot of the studies that I'll talk about are related to gender. And I also want to point out and recognize that identities are intersectional. And so people have a lot of complex and interacting identities, and we'll talk about that a little bit throughout the talk. Finally, a lot of the gender-related research that I'll discuss is presented as though gender is binary, and I recognize that this is not true. The studies do make some important points, and so I'm going to be talking about a number of these studies that just put things up as like, well, people are either male or female, and that's that. And so I just want to recognize that, like, whether they're using words male, female, or woman, man, gender is a spectrum, obviously. Okay, so let's jump in with some definitions. So many of you have probably heard of imposter syndrome before, and that's why you're here. And just to be perfectly clear about what we're talking about here, imposter syndrome is defined as the persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud, or that you don't belong in your chosen discipline or subfield. And there are a lot of nuances to this definition. And in fact, imposter syndrome or phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it, it's been around for quite a while. So one nice way of describing it was from Langford and Clance in 1993, and that imposter syndrome is believing that one's accomplishments came about not through genuine ability, but as a result of having been lucky, having worked harder than others, and having manipulated other people's impressions. So none of us want to feel like a manipulator, right? We want to feel like we're respected in our field and as scientists because of our accomplishments and because of our abilities and our hard work. And this is sort of like the opposite of that. I said imposter syndrome has been around a long time. In fact, actually much longer than 1993. It was first identified in 1978 by Suzanne Imes and Pauline Rose Clance. And what they initially wrote about and where they identified it was actually the imposter phenomenon in high achieving women, was what their study was about. And Clance was later quoted as saying, "If I could do it all over again, I would call it the imposter experience, because it's not a syndrome or a complex or a mental illness. It's something almost everyone experiences." So it was first identified in women, but it's something that really everyone has a little bit of this, and it varies with time and with your life stage and your career stage. All right, so I would like to start with a little bit of a self-assessment. So the question here is, do you feel like an imposter? These are 6 questions that are taken from an imposter syndrome like assessment mechanism. And what I'd like you to do, this is a workshop, right? I guess it's a webinar, but I want you to do a little bit of self-reflection a few times throughout this webinar. And this is the first time. So there are 6 questions here, and I want you to read these and answer each for yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not true at all the way up to 5, where this is very true. And I'd like you to write down your answer, your number for each of these questions, and then add up the number. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to report the number in an anonymous poll. So basically, I just want to get a quick pulse on how impostery everyone is feeling at this particular moment. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. And after that 2 minutes is up, you'll see the poll appear, and you can enter the range that your number falls in. So go ahead and start reading these questions. All right, so as you're finishing up, probably everyone has had moments where they're really proud of their accomplishments, and you've probably also had moments where you feel like an imposter. And if you've already gotten your number and you have a few extra seconds, try to identify or think a little bit about the characteristics of those times when you feel less confident or when you feel like an imposter. So what are the characteristics of those times? And Farah, in about 10 or 15 more seconds, you can go ahead and launch the poll. just a few more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and show the results. All right, so I believe what you're seeing here is that the majority of people have some affinity, so for experience these things at least sometimes. And I think what I want to point out here is just that there is a broad range here. At least somebody answered in all of these ranges. And it's okay if you identify with these statements, and it's also okay if you don't. What we're going to talk about today is useful no matter what. Imposter syndrome is something that varies with time and career stage. And so if you're not feeling it right now, that's awesome. I hope that people feel it less and less. But this is definitely something you should think about as a time varying thing, not necessarily something that's a constant. All right, so let's go on. So you may have gotten this from those questions and from the introduction. Imposter syndrome has a lot of different feelings associated with it. There can be feelings of phoniness and self-doubt. So if you find yourself thinking things like, I'm not as smart as everybody thinks I am, or I'm in way over my head. It also can be associated with the fear of being found out. Like, it's just a matter of time before people figure out I don't know what I'm doing. And I will say, I fully identify with many of these things. It's not that I feel like I'm an imposter all the time, but this is definitely something that has affected me throughout my career and continues to affect me, even as I become more senior in my position. It can also rear its head in terms of difficulty taking credit for accomplishments. If it's hard for you to think about deserving an award or an honor that you're given, or an opportunity even. It also, if you think that if you can do it, anyone can, that's another sort of marker for this, because you are bringing something special to what you're doing, and that you should be able to take credit for that. It can be associated with a frustration with inability to meet self-set standards. So for people who have a tendency to be a little bit perfectionist or a lot perfectionist, that's another marker for imposter syndrome, and something that makes it harder to get over imposter syndrome or to overcome those feelings. So if you find yourself thinking things like, I'm never going to be perfect at this, or I'm never going to be as good at this as I want to be. And finally, a lack of confidence or a fear of making mistakes. So if you find yourself thinking things like, I don't think I have what it takes to be an expert in this field, or to finish my PhD, or to finish my PhD as well as everyone else, or anything along those lines. What I want to talk about next is who suffers from imposter syndrome. So first of all, imposter syndrome affects everyone. That is definitely true, but it is more common and more severe among certain populations. So first of all, those who differ from the majority of their peers. So we're talking about members of underrepresented groups, or those who feel like they're other in some way from their peers. It's more severe among anyone embarking on a new endeavor. So if you're undertaking some new research, or you've just gotten a new job, or you've just started in graduate school or a new career, those are times when imposter syndrome is likely to be more severe than usual. And it's also more common in those situations. So that's a time when you should be looking out for it, because your feelings, if you feel inadequate when you start your PhD program, for example, it's likely due to this thing. It's also more common and more severe among those in technology or science careers, which is pretty interesting. So for scientists, this is something that affects us more than it affects people in other career paths. And one interesting group for which it is most severe is those who are genuinely extremely talented and capable individuals. So what's so interesting about that is that if you don't feel imposter syndrome, then maybe it's a signal that you're not actually as talented or capable as you think. That's sort of a funny way of saying it. But if you are extremely talented and capable, you are very likely to be experiencing this at times. Okay, That said, those who are in the majority population and also experience imposter syndrome. And I just want to ask a question. So this is going to be another poll. The question is, can you guess what fraction of Harvard or Stanford Business School incoming classes feel that they are the one mistake the admissions committee made? So Harvard and Stanford have been taking this data for several years now because they, somebody asked the question and they thought, oh, that's really interesting. And it turns out that the answer is about the same at both Harvard and Stanford Business Schools. So they asked the incoming class, do you feel like you are the one mistake the admissions committee made? What fraction of people do you think say yes to that question? So far, I can go ahead and launch that poll. So your choices are 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, or 3/4. And we'll just wait a second for these votes to come in. Ah, interesting. So I don't know if you see a histogram of, if you'll see a histogram of these results, or if you just see the percentages, but I think you'll all be surprised. Let's just give it 5 more seconds for anyone else who wants to vote. Okay, let's take a look at the answers. So this is a bimodal distribution, very interesting. So a large chunk of people thought it was between 1/4 and 1/3. And then another large chunk of people thought it was between 2/3 and 3/4. And the answer actually is between 2/3 and 3/4. And it's pretty consistent across Harvard and Stanford. That's really interesting. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of the incoming class of Harvard or Stanford Business School think that each individual thinks that they are the one mistake the admissions committee made. So that gives you a little idea of how prevalent this is and actually how severe. Like that's a pretty distinct discrepancy in someone's judgment about themselves versus like the actuality of it. Okay, so let's go on. Okay, so I want to give you a little example of how identity and self-perception are related to self-concept. So this is a study on academic self-concept in physiology, actually. And so what you're looking at, the title of the study here is Who Perceives They're Smarter? Exploring the influence of student characteristics on student academic self-concept in physiology. And this is a pretty recent study from 2018. And the way to read this is what you're looking at in each of these 2 plots is the controlling for all other factors, the average student of a particular gender and these students all have 3.3 GPA, they perceive they're smarter than this percentage of the rest of the class. So in the left panel, we have the controlling for all other factors, the average male student with a 3.3 GPA perceives they're smarter than 66% of the class, whereas the average female student with a 3.3 GPA perceives that they're smarter than 54% of the class. Those are statistically significant differences between how male and female students perceive themselves relative to their classmates. In the right panel, they disaggregated the data instead of by gender, by native language. And so this is sort of an example of intersectionality. So this is the percentage of classmates that the average native English speaker versus the average person for whom English is not their first language perceives they're smarter than. And you can see that people for whom English is their first language perceive that they're smarter than a larger fraction of their classmates than people for whom English is not their first language. This is understandable, especially like with the English, not English. It's an ease of communication thing, and people who have more facility with English language might have more confidence in expressing themselves and might express themselves more freely and view that in a certain way among their classmates. But these differences can lead to, and do lead to, differences in how students interact with each other. So like, for example, if you are an average student and you think that actually most of your classmates are smarter than you, then you may feel differently about proposing an alternate solution or pointing out an error in someone's work. On the other hand, if you're an average student and you think that you're smarter than most of your peers, that might lead you to dominate conversations So these differences in how we have in our own perception of ourselves can lead to differences in how we interact with people that do propagate into the rest of our into our experiences in a substantial way. There's one other aspect of this study that they looked at that I want to point out to you. Many of you have probably done group work as part of your college or maybe even graduate school experience. And so they also looked at the effect of small group work on self-concept. And they asked a sort of similar question. So what you're looking at here, you might just look at this picture and think this is a very strange result based on what I showed you on the previous slide, because we often think that group work is a sort of panacea for a more inclusive classroom. And many of you as TAs, you probably do group work with your classes too. This does need to be contextualized a little bit, because on all of these studies, context is really important. And so the result from this may not translate to a result in your classroom if you do group work in an intentional way. But the result of this study, what they found was that controlling for all other factors, the percent chance that an average student, differing only in gender, perceives that they're smarter than their group mate is much larger for men than it is for women. So male students were almost twice as likely as female students to think that they're smarter than their group mate, is what you're looking at here. And I'd like you to sort of put a mental bookmark here and maybe come back to this and reflect on some of your own experiences with group work later on. But I thought this was really interesting. And again, context is important. So we have to take all of these things with a grain of salt. And I invite you to read the study as well. All right, so anybody can have an imposter syndrome, but there are definitely some complicating factors for those who are members of underrepresented groups, and especially those who are members of multiple underrepresented or minoritized groups. So this is where intersectionality comes into play. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss some of these issues. So, we're going to be talking about those people for whom imposter syndrome is more common and more severe, specifically because they differ from the majority of their peers. There are a couple other things that are at play in these cases, actually many other things, but I want to talk about a few other definitions to get the conversation started. The first compounding or additional issue is called stereotype threat. Some of you have probably heard of stereotype threat before. The idea for stereotype threat is that people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. And if you feel yourself at risk of confirming negative stereotypes specifically, this has been shown to reduce the performance of individuals that belong to those negatively stereotyped groups. The first examples of this also came from gender research. So this is a study from, this is a part of the abstract of a study from 1998 called Stereotype Threat and Women's Math Performance. And the highlighted pieces here are sort of basically the bottom line, is that when women perform math, unlike men, they risk being judged by the negative stereotype that women have weaker math ability. This was what they found in their study in 1998. There's still truth to this today. And this was the first time that it was demonstrated that differences in performance could be eliminated when the stereotype threat was explicitly lowered. And in this study, the way that they lowered the stereotype threat was by saying, this test does not produce gender differences. When the test was described as producing gender differences, stereotype threat was high, women performed worse. When the test was described as not producing gender differences, stereotype threat was lessened and women performed better. So that was a pretty interesting result. And this has been confirmed in a lot of different populations. And it affects people in a lot of different ways. And you can imagine, again, going back to this concept of intersectionality, you can imagine that if you're a member of multiple negatively stereotyped groups, that you would have the stereotype threat from all of those groups at once. And the theory behind this is that it basically takes up mental space in your brain, like that worrying activity takes up brain activity that could be going to solve the problem. So instead you have this other thing that you're worrying about at the same time. Okay, so the last, or the third, I guess, definition that I want to supply, just so we have it throughout this conversation, is implicit or unconscious bias. And this is one that probably all of you have heard of, I would hope. The idea is that this is a bias in judgment or behavior that results from subtle cognitive processes. So these are not explicit biases or open prejudice, but this is something that is subconscious. and people describe it as implicit attitudes or implicit stereotypes. And these really operate at a level below conscious awareness and without intentional control. Without intentional control, I have a little, there are things you can do to minimize implicit bias. So if you haven't taken an implicit bias test, and I know that implicit bias research, and specifically this implicit bias test, you have to be a little bit careful with, because this is not, this isn't like the be all and end all of scientific metrics. So be careful with what you find there, but it does provide an interesting baseline, especially if you're thinking about how you personally, just examining your personal attitudes and subconscious feelings about particular groups. So Project Implicit has tons of different bias tests you can take. One of them is gender, and specifically gender in science. There are others that are related to body image and skin color and things like that. Biases do have real consequences though. So knowing them about yourself is a good first step. It's also important to know what you're up against. So this is data from a study from 2012 called Science Faculty's Subtle Gender Biases Favor Male Students. And what they did in this study was they sent out, it was a randomized double-blind study with 127 study participants. These study participants were science faculty from research-intensive universities. And basically they rated the application materials of a hypothetical student who was applying for a job as a laboratory manager position. So the study participants here were faculty in chemistry, physics, and biology. And they all received the same CV or resume to rate. However, half of them had a male gendered name at the top and the other had a female gendered name at the top. So I think it was John and Jennifer. And then participants were asked to provide feedback on the materials, including like, would you hire them? What salary do you think you would give them when they first started? And what you're looking at here is the average salary that people said they would give the male student in dark color, so a little over $30,000 per year, versus the student who had a female gendered name at the top of their application, which was like $26,500 per year. That is a huge difference for a starting salary. And the only difference in the qualifications of this person, the only difference in any of the application materials that were received was the name at the top of the application. Now, this is extremely upsetting to a lot of us. And one of the questions that I often get is, were the results the same if the student was submitting an application to a male professor versus a female professor? And no matter how you disaggregate the data, the results are basically the same. So this is definitely evidence of bias in which men and women judge identical resumes differently as a function of the name at the top. And it is bad. There were other things that they also looked at in this study. So they looked at they were asked to rate the competence, hireability, and how likely they would be to mentor the student. And then they broke it apart by the male applicant and the female applicant CVs. And you can see that in each case, in terms of competence, in terms of whether they were hireable, and maybe like the one that's most pernicious is how likely faculty are to be willing to mentor the student. The male student rated higher than, or the male applicant rated higher than the female applicant. So this is something that makes me very angry. It's probably making a lot of you very angry right now. When I talk about this in groups and people, I can just see people fuming at this point. And it's okay to be angry about this. I think it's good to be angry about this. But there are also things like we have to think practically about what we can do to mitigate the effects of things like this. And so I always emphasize that there are things you can do. The first is to understand the behavior and actions of others. So understanding things like implicit bias and talking about them with people. And also there are ways to use strategies and tactics to optimize your success. So to help this not happen. We'll talk a little bit about some specific strategies later in this presentation. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that this is putting pressure on you all. This is putting pressure on what you can do about a system that is not a good system, the system and the culture that created these issues. And so I am going to reserve the last few minutes of this talk to bring up some things that we can all do to help change the system, rather than just sort of have to respond to it. All right, so that was one example of real biases that have real consequences for real people. And there are many, many studies. So I stole this slide from Jesse Smith, who is at Montana State University in the MAD lab. And this is just a collection of some examples of places where gender bias has been confirmed. And the message is just that everywhere you look for it, you will find it. So in elite postdoc positions, in grant success, teaching evaluations, conference speaker invitations, everywhere you look for it, you're going to find it. I will say that people know this now, which is great. So these studies, all these references are from years ago now. And so people are working on these things, but there are biases do exist and they do have real world consequences. All right, so coming back to our three invisible actors, imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, and implicit bias. These are issues that affect all of us, whether you are part of an underrepresented group or not. They have the potential to influence your relationships with your peers and colleagues. They also have the potential to subvert your judgment or best intentions. That sounds like very nefarious. But if you have implicit biases that you're not aware of, you may be interacting with people in a way that you're not intending to, or you may be making decisions or judgments that you're not intending to. And in order to make judgments and have interactions that are faithful to your values, you have to learn about yourself and be able to combat things like implicit bias. So they also often crop up at inconvenient times. So for example, in job negotiations, or applications, or when you're doing a scientific presentation even, that's like a high stress environment where imposter syndrome might be heightened. The good news is that one way that you can decrease the effects of these things is by talking about them. So discussing things like imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, and implicit bias, and other sort of social issues related to our career paths and education paths. Discussing those things with peers and colleagues can have positive effects. So there's a study from 2010 that showed that that young women are more likely to see themselves in a physics career after discussing some of the social issues associated with gender and some of the gender issues associated with physics careers. And it also results in an improved climate for everybody. So I think it's part of our professional responsibility to be conversant in these issues. And that's another reason why it's important to discuss them with peers and colleagues. Okay, now I listed those invisible actors as 3 separate bullet points, but these things are all intimately related. So we know that imposter syndrome thrives when competition is intense, when there are few mentors to provide a reality check, when you feel different from your peers or different from a typical scientist, or when you fear conforming to or confirming a negative stereotype. And these are related to underrepresentation, implicit bias, and stereotype threat very explicitly. So if we take these things together, members of underrepresented groups may experience implicit bias in a lot of different ways, including like comments about or microaggressions related to not belonging or being different. Being different from the majority population can reinforce some of those fears of confirming negative stereotypes. So there's stereotype threat. And all of these things can make you feel like even more of an outsider and compound what is a common thing, but that thing that is imposter syndrome. So a common feature between all of these, and it's not the only feature by any means, but one common feature is a sort of disconnect between who we are, so our personal values and identity, and who the community perceives us to be and what the professional community identity is. I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about this and digging into the concept of identity a little bit more carefully. So let's talk about identity and its relationship to competence or perceived competence in science fields. Identity has many different definitions, and there are different types of identities, but if we're thinking about sort of the group identity definition, a good one comes from Leary and Tangney in 2003. They defined identity as the distinctive characteristics shared by all members of a particular social group. And you can think of that as a professional group as well. Now that's a group identity, but we also have personal identities, and personal identities are complex, they're intersectional. Some parts of your personal identity are public, other parts of your personal identity are private. And what is public versus private depends usually on what your social group or your professional group is that you're interacting with. So I would like you all to take just about 1 minute and jot down as many things as you can to fill in this blank. I am a blank. So for me, as an example, I might say I'm a physicist, I am a parent, I'm a spouse, I'm a Scrabble player, whatever you feel like putting in this blank. And obviously, we're not going to share these, so feel free to put down anything you want. So I'm going to give you about 1 minute now. All right, so I hope you had some time to jot down some parts of your identity. There's one more identity that I didn't mention here, and that is that I am a white woman. And my identity as a white woman and its relationship to the community identity is definitely something that has impacted my career and my professional relationships. And so it's part of my interest in understanding that has led me to the moment when I'm here today discussing these things with you. So I hope you all have some aspects of your identity that you've jotted down. The next thing to think about is the relationship between your personal identity and the community identity. And here the community that I'm considering is the community of physicists. So does your personal identity match up with the physics community identity? Community identities are also complex and evolving. It's not that they're static, but because they are a community, because they encompass more people, they are more static than a personal identity often. And there's an important relationship between community identity and professional competence. Okay, and this comes from social science research. I apologize that I didn't put a citation here. I am working from home, as you can see, and my resources are actually in my office, so I did not have access to the one where that this comes from. But please contact me later if you'd like more information on this, because this is really a sticking point of this whole discussion and something that it all really hinges on. Our professional competence is judged in a lot of different ways. It's judged in our interactions with peers and colleagues. If you're a student, it's judged based on your grades or exams, or if you're writing research papers, on your paper reviews, your research accomplishments. And another important way that our competence is judged is by our ability to convince others that we're good at our work. So just thinking about that, people's opinions are formed based on the public parts of who we are and what we do. And so when people are thinking about, are we competent scientists, often they're making this comparison of the public part of our personal identity that we're sharing and comparing that with the community identity. The reason this is important is because of how your identity matches up with the community identity. So did you write down physicist as part of your personal identity? I hope you all did. And I hope you think about that and internalize it. I just want to say, anyone who is an undergraduate physics major, you are a physicist. Like, you are now a physicist. Congratulations. So that should be part of your personal identity. It's part of what you do on a daily basis. It's part of what you think about. And there are some other sort of detailed aspects of the identity of physicists as part of personal identity. So there's the aspect of it that's the sense of who you are. So that means recognizing it yourself and also having others recognize that you are a physicist. There's also an aspect related to what you believe you're capable of. So that could be what kind of, do you believe you're competent? What kind of performance do you expect of yourself and believe you're capable of? And then there's the aspirational part. So what do you want to do and become in regard to science or physics? So in your career or in your education. Okay, I hope that physicist is part of your identity. And I also want to talk a bit about how we build that identity. So strengthening your science identity, your identity as a physicist, is one thing that will help match you, like help your personal identity match with the physics community identity. And that is a thing that's demonstrated to decrease imposter syndrome. Now, I don't want to, obviously I don't want anyone to change their personal identity. You are who you are, and strengthening all parts of your identity is important. But I do want to make sure that your identity includes being a physicist. I hope so. So if you don't think you're a physicist, it's much more likely that you're going to feel more like an imposter, as opposed to if you have that strong science identity. Okay. As a physicist, your career is likely to be long, right? And it's a journey. Begins when you're a student and it continues long after that. And so hopefully you have long-term career goals as well as short-term career goals and short-term education goals. And along that journey, it's important to know yourself and be true to your values and identity. So as I said, I don't want anyone to change their personal identity, but I do want you to strengthen the part of your identity that is related to being a physicist. So one important aspect of that is knowing your goals and keeping your goals and aspirations in mind throughout the journey. And the advice that we often get that's related to that has to do with not being distracted by bad behavior, finding common ground, and figuring out obstacles and how to work around them. You know, that sounds like it doesn't sound good. It's a lot of things that we're asking people to do because we're asking you to function in a system and a culture that is not supportive of everyone. And that is really distressing to a lot of us. So again, we'll talk about that more at the end. But I want to take one example from this about the obstacles, because there are obstacles, and we already talked about one as being implicit bias, but I want to give you a concrete example of how to identify an obstacle and then actually use specific strategies to work around it or to work through it. So this example is in letters of recommendation. You all, most of you are students, and so you've probably all asked for a letter of recommendation at some point. And this study is about gender differences in recommendation letters for postdoctoral fellowships in geoscience. Now, geoscience is interesting because people who have finished their PhD and are applying for a postdoctoral position submit all of their application materials, including letters of recommendation, to a central clearinghouse. And that central clearinghouse sends the letters out to the jobs that the people want to apply for. So they basically have access to all of this information. And so what this study did was they took all of the letters of recommendation for 1 year and they coded them so that they could put them in a bucket of, this is an excellent letter of recommendation, this is a good letter of recommendation, and then there's a third bucket that you don't want to be in, this is a not very good letter of recommendation. And then once they were in those buckets, they broke them apart by gender. So they looked at the characteristics of a letter and decided whether it was a letter for a male applicant, a letter for a man, or a letter for a woman. And so you can see in this figure, what's shown is the percentage of the applications for that gender group that fall into each of the excellent, good, and then it's not shown, but the not good buckets. So if you are a man and you've requested a letter of recommendation, this particular year for a postdoc in geoscience, 24% of the time, 24% of those applications will have letters that are excellent. 73% of those applications will have letters that are good. If you're a woman who has applied for a postdoc in geosciences, only 15% of the time will you have an excellent letter, and 83% of the time you'll have a letter that's just good. So we all want to be in that excellent bucket, right? We want our letters to be in there. And the reason that there is a gender disparity here is not because of a disparity in the applicants or their capabilities. This is a disparity in how people are communicating the applicant's capabilities in their letters of recommendation. So what can we do about it? Many of you have probably heard this before, but I want to take a minute and emphasize it because it is so important. The very first thing that you can do is ask for a strong letter of recommendation. So I know you all are sitting probably by yourselves in front of your computers, but I want you to say this phrase out loud. I want you to say on the count of 3, can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? 1, 2, 3. Can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? It might be difficult to say some of these things the first time, and it's worth actually practicing out loud. So asking for a strong letter is the very first thing you can do, and I hope that you're all doing that already. As a faculty member, it's our job to write letters of recommendation, and we will be very honest with you about what we can say and what we can't say in our letters. So having an open conversation about it is really important, and that's a good way to start that open conversation. You can also suggest that your letter writer emphasize certain aspects of, or certain things about you or certain aspects of your application to complement other parts of your application, like your CV or your personal statement. Speaking of your CV, you can write your CV so that your technical achievements are highlighted. This is going to help when you ask for a letter, you should always give your CV or resume to your letter writer, and that will help them translate that into technical statements in your letters too, that will help you have a more excellent letter, a more applicable letter. And finally, you can use active voice for your accomplishments on your CV and in your personal statements. So you can say things like, I or my group discovered or wrote or led or built a certain piece of equipment. All of those things using active voice will help whoever is reading the letter understand that, or the letter or your CV, understand your role and value you for that role. And it will also help your letter writers, when they read things like that, translate that active voice into active statements in your letters, which will help them end up in this excellent bin as well. And there are other suggestions too, but this is just one example of how the first obstacle here is implicit bias. The reason that there is a gender disparity is because of implicit bias. Actually, there's another hidden obstacle here that's not completely apparent immediately, and that is imposter syndrome. If you're going to ask for a strong letter and you're going to ask your letter writer to emphasize certain things, and you're going to write your CV in an active voice saying you discovered things or wrote things or led things, it's hard to say those things when you're feeling imposter syndrome, when you're feeling that it's actually an accident that you were able to contribute to those things. So the second obstacle that's hidden is imposter syndrome. But the more we know about that and think about it, the easier it is to overcome. Not that it's easy, but possible. All right, so how do we get past this imposter business? I'm gonna go through a couple slides of like just solid practical tips of how to get past imposter syndrome. And then again, the last slide is reserved for talking about the system that creates imposter syndrome to begin with. So the very first tip is to name it. And you all are here right now, so you are hopefully capable of doing this. Name imposter syndrome as a thing that is happening to you. You can use other words to describe it, but understand that it is extremely common. And what you are feeling is not because of a lack of your own ability, it's because of your perception of your ability, and you can work to change your perception. Remind yourself that you are not a mistake. So thinking back to the Harvard and Stanford business schools, I wonder what the results are for physics graduate schools or advanced courses for physics undergraduates. Do people think that they made it there by accident or that they were a mistake that the admissions committee made? What I want to remind you of is that the people who put you where you are very competent, and they made deliberate choices based on your experiences and your potential. So you are not an accident, you are not a mistake, and you are there in the position that you're in because people have confidence in you and know that you can do this. Focus on what you can control. So you might be feeling a little bit out of control after just talking about implicit biases that others have, but we talked about a way that you can at least in some ways take control of that situation. You can also take control by creating and seizing opportunities, excuse me, and giving yourself credit when you're able to do so. So when you do have an accomplishment, name it and be proud of it. Seek out supportive, encouraging mentors. So mentors are extremely important because they provide a reality check. If you're having a day when you're not feeling like you belong or like you are capable of taking this exam on Friday or whatever it is, mentors are people who are there to help you. They can help you recognize that your feelings are normal, that your feelings may be irrational, and they can help you work through those. So seek out encouraging mentors and use them for support. And if your mentors aren't performing that function, two things. One, I'm using mentor plural because you should always have many mentors. These can be peers or they can be people more senior to you. But also if they're not performing that function, seek out new mentors. The larger mentoring community you build for yourself, the better. Recognize your expertise and how much you've learned and how much you can give back. One great way to recognize your accomplishments, how much you've learned, is to be a TA or a tutor or a mentor to more junior students. Those things really help build your confidence, and they help you feel like you do belong, like you are an authority, and you deserve the position that you have. Inventory your accomplishments. So this literally means write down a list of the things you have accomplished and focus on this list when you feel like a phony or a failure. This is something that a lot of more senior people do. Like I am even thinking of myself at this moment, not to be too revealing, but it's important to remind yourself of the things that you've accomplished and the things you've been recognized for, and that those were not accidents, because sometimes it's very easy to forget. Learn to take mistakes or failure in stride. Become unperfectionist. We should all be thinking of ourselves as work in progress. We don't get it right the first time. We certainly don't. Often we don't report how many experiments failed or how many mistakes we made before things actually worked out. But we all make mistakes and we all fail. And so recognize that, and it's okay, and get better at picking yourself up after mistakes or failure. Ask for help when you need it. Everyone should do this. There is no shame in asking for help. In fact, if you don't know how to do something, the best way to figure it out is to ask a coworker or a fellow student. If you can't figure out how to solve a problem, seek advice. This is so, so important. And I'm saying that, I also recognize that it is so, so hard to do sometimes. So build yourself a community of people that you feel comfortable asking for help. And the more everyone asks for help, the more it's normalized. All right, so the last couple here are rewrite your mental script from I am an imposter, if you're feeling that, to I may not know all the answers, but I'm capable of figuring this out. I would say that the most important thing I learned in graduate school was that I am capable of figuring things out. This is a thing that gave me confidence to move on in my career as a physicist, both in terms of strengthening my physics identity, but also in terms of having the confidence to pursue new and exciting ideas and think about things I hadn't thought about before. So this is like extremely important for a variety of reasons. And the more you practice saying these things to yourself, the easier it gets. Okay, and the last one that I have on this list is own your achievements and celebrate them. It is only very recently that I'm able to graciously accept a compliment. And I remember being in school and really struggling when somebody did give me a compliment on anything, and just feeling really terrible about it. And that is a thing that is difficult to learn, but it's worth working on. And once you learn to accept compliments and own your achievements, then you can work on learning how to celebrate them and really being proud of yourself. There's one last piece of advice, and this comes from some research by Amy Cuddy, who gave what was, in 2018, this TED Talk called Your Body Language May Shape Who You Are. This TED Talk was the second most watched TED Talk in the history of TED Talks. So Amy Cuddy's research has to do with portraying confidence and something called power posing. Actually, they're changing the wording on this. I forget the modern term they're using for it. But basically, the idea is at the top of the slide, fake it till you become it. So Amy Cuddy's research shows that power posing, which is getting into something like a Wonder Woman pose, which she's demonstrating in the figure, or like any sort of open, shoulders back, like powerful pose. If you hold a pose like that for 2 minutes, and I invite you to do this right now, actually, if you'd like to stand up at your computer and see how it feels. If you do these power poses for 2 minutes, it causes two things. So their initial research showed that it causes elevated levels of hormones associated with leadership, and confidence goes hand in hand with that. And it also, they demonstrated that people who did power posing for 2 minutes had enhanced performance in high stress interviews. So this is what her research showed from years ago. I put a little asterisk next to the hormone research because some of these claims were disputed with additional research. It's still not completely, the picture is not still completely clear. The enhanced performance in high stress interviews was initially disputed and then reconfirmed later. So that actually is a confirmed scientific finding. But in any case, I invite you to try it. And so the idea is that even if you're not sure of your abilities, and you're not totally confident, it's really important that you present yourself otherwise. So shifting your body language to portray confidence. The top bullet that I have here also says accept opportunities even if you're terrified, and do what you can to make it through it. So it's not about tricking others into thinking you have confidence, although that can happen. It's about tricking your own body so that you become more confident. So what Amy Cuddy's research shows that if you do these poses, then it actually makes you more confident in your abilities. So I invite you to try it. It may not be for everyone, but it's certainly, I find it very interesting, and I do practice it on occasion as well. And I also encourage you to watch the TED Talk because it's really, really interesting about her journey as a scientist too. Okay, so that is the end of my advice. The very last thing that I have here, as promised, I want to talk a little bit about changing the system. And part of the reason is that I always feel a little bit like icky or wrong after spending so much time talking about how we can fix ourselves in order to overcome things like implicit bias or imposter syndrome. Really, the root of why we feel these things to begin with is related to like the system and the culture of our discipline and society. That's why different groups feel these things differently. So, you know, wouldn't it be great if we imagine a world where like people are not disproportionately affected by feelings of being a fraud or that they don't belong? And so like, if we think about what that looks like, that's awesome. And we also want to think about how do we get there, because that's really the goal. So here are some suggestions that I have. I want to say to begin with that as a more senior person in a faculty job and, you know, in my role as an associate dean, the weight is on my shoulders to change the system, and I fully accept that burden. As a student, you can play a critical role too, and so there are some things that you can do as a student that are really important. But I just to preface this, really, like, it is my responsibility to change the system too. So one thing you can do is to continue to remind your senior colleagues that the system does not work for everyone and that it is their responsibility to change that. The more that message comes from the more people, the better. Supporting each other is really critical. You can choose to be collaborative or you can choose to be competitive in your courses, in your research, as a colleague, as a friend. And so that's your decision to make, and I urge you to make supportive choices. Be visible and use visibility. You can use visibility in a lot of ways. So one way that you can use visibility is to enhance belonging and science identity for others. So for example, you can highlight the scientific contributions of scientists from underrepresented groups, enhancing their visibility, helping to create a better sense of belonging for people in those groups. You can speak up. So this bullet says, speak up, don't be complicit in perpetuating harmful norms. There is a lot packed into that. There are two sort of basic things that I want to talk about. One is, many of you have probably heard of bystander or ally training. If you have not taken a bystander or ally training, I strongly urge you to do so. What bystander training does, one of the main goals is it teaches you and it helps you practice how to speak up in uncomfortable situations. And that could be something as simple as saying, excuse me, I don't really understand what you just said. Anything to prompt the person who said something to prompt the person to think more deeply about how their words and actions are affecting others. And of course, there are many other ways to stand up and be a bystander. But if you haven't had training in it, the training is definitely worthwhile. Another way that students can speak up is by talking to research group leaders, department chairs, professors, instructors, TAs. It's not your job to make these people who are more senior than you aware of the problems and solutions, but it can also be very effective. So if you feel comfortable doing that, that can be a really important strategy. All right, and finally, another thing you can do that I think is really important is to demand that senior scientists are conversant in the terminology and current state of knowledge related to equity, and specifically equity issues in physics. This is something that we can all do better. And I can give you one quick example from the last few weeks of how this has played out in some of the circles that I'm a part of. The American Institute of Physics a few years ago, commissioned a national task force to elevate African-American representation in undergraduate physics, which is called Team Up. And this task force was active for 2 years. They did investigations, they studied research, they collected data, and then they released in January a huge report with tons of information and recommendations. And I know that some people read it when it initially came out, but in the last 2 weeks, as many of us have been thinking more deeply and taking the time to think about racial justice and structural racism and the consequences of it and how it relates to our roles as academics and scientists, I can tell you that a lot of people are very familiar with this report now. And I think that is awesome. This thing is an absolute treasure trove of information and action items. And so it's really great that people are now seeing that. But the more that this message, that it's important for us to know about these things, to understand the current state of knowledge and what the current best practices are, because people have studied these things and they know how to improve this, how to change the system and improve things for everybody. The more we can respect that knowledge and be conversant in it and use it to make changes, the better. All right, these are my first thoughts, and I would love to hear more from you during the Q&A. So if you have questions or thoughts on this, comments are also welcome. With that, I will just head to my summary. So what we've talked a lot about today are understanding the issues and understanding ourselves, how we cultivate our professional identity and practice saying and feeling, I am a physicist. Thinking about ways that you can give yourself credit and how important that is to recognize your own accomplishment. How to not only seize every opportunity, but also create opportunities for yourself and take full advantage of those. And lastly, I always end by saying, like, don't forget to have fun, which sounds sort of, silly. But on the other hand, I am thrilled that I get to be a physicist every day. And I hope that you are too. So I will end there and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.